Hey everybody, I want to welcome you to our Esther Bible study. We are finishing up the story of Esther in this series, Take Heart Tonight. We're going to look at chapters 8 and 9 because this is just kind of the end of the book of Esther. And so before we go into our next series, which is through the book of 1 John, we're just going to kind of wait and see what happens as far as when we would be able to meet together and all that stuff. And so just kind of take a short little break. But what we saw last week in the book of Esther was the turning point of the story. So just to recap, this story starts off with King Xerxes, the ruler of the Persian Empire. He gets mad at his wife because she will not go in front of his circle of buddies. And he asked her to do that naked so he could show her off in front of her friends and his friends. But so she doesn't do it. He sends her away and establishes a process to find a new queen that is basically like, if you've ever seen the show The Bachelor, that's basically what it was. I mean, he brings in all of these young, beautiful women. They get spa treatments and mani-pedis. They get the best makeup and hairdressers. And then they all gather and go before the king, and he chooses Esther to be the new queen. And one of the first things that we find out about Esther is that she is a Jewish orphan. The Jews had come to Persia previously as exiles and slaves, and they were allowed at some point to go back, but for whatever reason, Mordecai, who is taking care of Esther after her parents died, decides not to go back. And so the Jews in the Persian Empire had no positions of power. They were not looked at in a positive light. And so when Esther becomes the queen, her cousin Mordecai says, hey, maybe you should keep your identity a secret for a while. Like, don't go around telling everybody that you're a Jew. It's not going to look good for us. And that's what she does until Mordecai happens to uncover a plot where two guys want to assassinate Xerxes. And so that leads to this series of events where Mordecai goes to Esther, tells her about this discovery, this plot that he found out about. Esther then goes to Xerxes, and they arrest the guys who are plotting to kill Xerxes. And then, so that does not happen again, Xerxes appoints a man named Haman to be his his head of security. And he has all the authority to arrest and imprison and kill anyone that he thinks might be suspicious. Well, the first person that he acts out against in this new position is Mordecai, the guy who should get credit for saving the king's life and uncovering this assassination plot, but Mordecai refuses to bow down to Haman, and so Haman acts out against him. He does a little background work on Mordecai and finds out that Mordecai is Jewish, and then he makes a plan to kill all the Jews. He convinces Xerxes that this is a good idea, that this is something that they should do, and so Xerxes comes up with this edict. They send it out through the empire and throughout the kingdom that essentially says, and if you've ever seen the movie The Purge, this is kind of like that anyone who sees a Jewish person out in the street or knows that somebody like a Jewish family is at home, that they can just go and kill them. So now let's pause right there, because there are two truths that we've said this whole time through the story of Esther. Number one, that God is absent, but really he's not absent, because the book of Esther is the only book in the Bible where God is not mentioned. We've said that over and over again. You'll never find a page on Esther where it talks about God. His name is not there. But also number two, that even though God is never mentioned, it is clear that he is sovereign over everything that's going on here, this whole process. He's in control of all that is happening. So it's no accident that Esther is Jewish. It's no accident that she gets chosen to be the queen. It's no accident that her cousin Mordecai tells her to keep her identity quiet. It's no accident that Mordecai just so happens to be the guy that finds out about this assassination attempt on King Xerxes. And it's not an accident that he has this direct connection to Esther, who he raised, his cousin, and puts an end to it. Now, speaking of God's sovereignty and control and there not being any accidents in this story, when we look at the world around us today, the things that are going on in our nation, the death of George Floyd, the peaceful protest, the non-peaceful protest. I believe that it's also not an accident that we have been going through this story of Esther, which is about some of the things that we see about personal racism, about systemic racism, justice and injustice. Maybe it's not an accident that we have been going through this book at this time, because there are so many things that we see happening here that we are watching almost every day in the news. Just as Mordecai told Esther in chapter 4 that you have been made a queen for such a time as this. Maybe going through this book, we have been going through this for a time of what we see, the world seemingly going wild and crazy, but that knowing that we can take heart because God is sovereign, God is in control. Yesterday, I started to sit down and read through the end of Esther, the last 3 chapters, and we're not going to talk about chapter 10 today, but it just kind of stuck out to me, the parallels between Esther and what is going on in our society and in our culture today. You have Haman, who is outrightly displaying racism. If you look back at chapter 3, when Haman decides to do something about Mordecai, who won't bow down to him, verse 6 says, "Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom." In other words, it wasn't good enough for him to just take care of the problem in Mordecai. Like, he wanted to go further than that. I mean, he could have had Mordecai arrested and put in jail for the rest of Mordecai's life, and that would have been the end of the story. But his impetus is to kill a whole race of people. You have Xerxes, who sends out the death sentence of the Jews, and I don't think that Xerxes specifically parallels anyone, but it's an example of systemic racism, how the system, the law, favors one race or another, or puts one race at a disadvantage over another or under another. And then you have Mordecai, who is kind of like the George Floyd in this story. I mean, he is unjustly targeted by Haman, who is the authority, and Mordecai really represents a race of people here, and in this case, the Jewish people. Now, the situation that we find the world in today, systemic injustice, racism, riots, protests, one thing that is clear, at least in my mind, is that there are no simple answers of how we can make sense of this. Any simple answer to all of this is probably a wrong answer. So let's finish the book of Esther here, and let's see if there's some kind of truth here that we could possibly apply to our situation today, because the Bible, while it was not written to us, it was written for us, and we can find applications for how we are supposed to live our lives even today. So at the end of chapter 7, we see the death of Haman. Previously, Esther throws this party and pleads Xerxes to save her people, and she points out Haman as kind of the architect for the destruction of the Jewish people. Xerxes leaves the party. Haman is begging Esther for his life, and then that's where we pick up in chapter 7 in verse 8. It says, "Just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. The king exclaimed, 'Will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house?' And as soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face." This is like hitman style. "Then Harbana, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, 'A pole reaching to a height of 50 cubits stands by Haman's house. He had it set up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king.' The king said, 'Impale him on it.' So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai." This is irony right here. "And then the king's fury subsided." Chapter 8, verse 1 says, "That same day King Xerxes gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. Mordecai came into the presence of the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. The king took off the signet ring which he had reclaimed from Haman and presented it to Mordecai, and Esther appointed him over Haman's estate. Esther again pleaded with the king, falling at his feet and weeping. She begged him to put an end to the evil plan of Haman the Agagite, which he had devised against the Jews. The king extended the gold scepter to Esther, and she arose and stood before him. So, crazy turn of events here. Xerxes walks into the room. Haman is begging Esther for his life. He trips, falls down on the couch over Esther, where Esther is sitting on the couch. Xerxes sees this and is like, no, he did not. No, he is not like coming on to my wife right here in my own house. And so the eunuchs come in, they put a bag over his head, take him out to the pole, to the gallows that Haman had set up for Mordecai. And that is the very pole that Haman himself dies on. And then everything that Haman owns, his estate, his household, his possessions, his boat, his car, all of that stuff is given over to Esther, and then Esther hands it over to Mordecai. So the king gave Mordecai his signet ring. That's a symbol of power and authority. So here's Mordecai, who is a target of Haman's wrath, his racism, if you will, and now he has authority over everything that Haman owned. I'm reading this book by a guy by the name of Mike Hosper, and this is a book he actually wrote about Esther. It's called Faith Among the Faithless, and this is what he says about this turn of events. He says, Haman's crocodile finally grew too large, too hungry, and turned on its master. This is why Haman didn't die of old age in the comfort of his palace. His appetite for power flared when it was confronted by the unflinching resistance of Mordecai, inspiring him to erect the stake that ultimately took his own life. His grandiose vision led him to presume that the king would want to honor him above all the other subjects. It also led to his resentment of Mordecai and the building of spectacular 75-foot stake. Those who resisted his spectacular authority he thought deserved a spectacular death. Yet it was he, not Mordecai, who became the spectacle. Grasping for power, like grasping for anything, will ultimately lead to self-destruction. That thing that we grasp for, that thing that we've deluded ourselves into believing holds the key to making us ultimately and spectacularly happy. It cannot be held onto, and it will ultimately eat you alive. In other words, the story of Haman is a story of idolatry and foolishness. Idolatry is when we worship the wrong things, when we make something more important than it actually is. And when you worship something that ultimately can't give you any real meaning, it turns into self-destruction. Racism is idolatry. It is search for meaning based on skin color and authority and power. And we see that Haman is an example of that destruction. And so the story of Esther goes into chapter 8, and in verse 7, we pick it up there. It says, King Xerxes replied to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, because Haman attacked the Jews, I will give his estate to Esther, and impaled him on the pole that he set up. Now write another decree in the king's name in behalf of the Jews as seems best to you, and seal it with the king's signet ring. For no document written in the king's name and sealed with his ring can be revoked. So in other words, he can't just go back and take back that law, that edict that he sent out giving the Jews a death sentence. It can't be revoked. But he's giving Mordecai and Esther the authority to do something else. So at once, in verse 9, the royal secretaries were summoned. On the 23rd day of the third month, in the month of Sivan, they wrote out all Mordecai's orders to the Jews and to the satraps and governors and nobles of the 127 provinces stretching from India to Cush. These orders were written in the script of each province in the language of each people, and also to the Jews in their own script and language. Mordecai wrote in the name of Xerxes, sealed the dispatches with the king's signet ring, and sent them by mounted couriers who rode fast horses, specially bred for the king. The king's edict granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves, to destroy, kill, and annihilate the armed men of any nationality or province who might attack them and their women and children, and to plunder the property of the enemies. And so actually the Jews still celebrate this day where Esther kind of saved their lives and they were able to protect themselves. It's called Purim. I think it's probably turned into something that it originally wasn't supposed to be. It's kind of like Mardi Gras now. You can like Google search Purim or Purim, but yeah, they still celebrate this this time when Esther stepped in to save their lives. So Xerxes just couldn't undo the order he had previously sent out. So instead, he creates a new order, or at least gives Mordecai the authority to do so, where the Jewish people have the right to defend themselves. And so that when the people come out to kill the Jews, they were met with resistance. Not exactly a perfectly aligned parallel, but you can kind of see how this is similar to some of the protests, the right to assemble, to speak up against an injustice. Now, the violent and non-peaceful protests that we're seeing on the news every night and on our social media timelines, I'm not saying that those things are biblical. I'm saying that the riots that we see where property gets destroyed and people, innocent people in a lot of cases, are getting hurt and even killed, those are not good and they're not helpful. Instead of making things better, in some ways they're probably making things worse. But again, there's no simple answers to any of this stuff. This stuff. I heard one pastor say it like this. He said, "Sin has to become exceedingly sinful more than just to the people who are victims in order for there to be a collective response." So in order for Xerxes to do the right thing, this is another parallel. Esther had to stand up for what is right. She had to stand up for truth and justice. And she had to influence Xerxes to make this new edict. And that's kind of what makes her the hero of this story. But as good as it was for Esther for her to risk her life by standing up to Xerxes in order to save her people, she could only do so much. More Hamans would come along throughout history. We know that the Jewish people have always been under attack. But in this story, God had to soften Xerxes' heart in order for him to do the right thing. Because the truth about sin is that sinful men rarely do the right thing, if ever at all, because it's the right thing to do. Sin has broken every part of our world. It has broken every system, and from our government, from our institutions and organizations. The world around us is full of sin, and as long as people have sinful hearts, people will always do the wrong thing. We will never get rid of injustice. We will never get rid of things like divorce and abuse and favoritism and racism, because sin will always be around until Jesus comes back. So if we know our Bible, we shouldn't be surprised at all that broken people respond to a broken world in broken ways, in unrighteous ways. That's what we see in racism. That's what we see in riots and non-peaceful protests. And that's what we see when sin manifests itself in everyday life. And so the point we need to see in our culture today, the way that we need to make sense of this is the same way that Xerxes needed to make sense of what he was supposed to do in response to Esther and Mordecai. It's the same thing that the Persian people needed to see when the Jewish people were given the right to assemble and protect themselves. And that is this, that this is the brokenness that Jesus came to die for. Jesus came to die for sinners. And just like God had to soften the heart of Xerxes, God has to soften the heart of idolaters who worship a certain race. God has to soften the hearts of a collective society and a culture towards love instead of hate. And God has to work in us to be salt and light. Salt is no good in a shaker, and light is no good covered up. So take the opportunities that you have to be an Esther, to be different, to be obedient to God in your family, in your circle of friends, in your school, on your teams. Use the influence that you have to be like Esther and point people to Jesus, because Jesus is the only one that can heal our broken world. He's the only one that can fix our sinful hearts. Let's pray. God, I just thank you for the book of Esther and how it is so relevant to our day, and that's not something I planned when we decided to go through the book of Esther that this would end with all the things that are happening in the world, but it's such a almost a spooky message to us and a picture of Haman and racism and injustice. But Father, it points us to Jesus. You sent your Son to heal the brokenness in the world, and there will always be brokenness until either our hearts get right with you or until you come back. Help us to be salt and light. Help us to be influencers in our circles of influence, our groups of friends, our teams, our schools, our classes, Lord. Help us to align with you and help us to point others towards you as the only healing we can ever fully experience. In Jesus' name, amen.